Leading a startup team, whether you're delivering a sugar rush, stocking coffee, or getting a regular delivery of snacks, Office Depot has solutions that fit every startup culture, from getting those first business cards and stationery to ordering fleece pullovers with your new logo. To learn how Office Depot and the California Technology Council have partnered to bring you savings on all of these startup essentials and more, go to californiatechnology.org/member benefits. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Mergers and acquisitions may be a path to creating value for life science companies, but talks can break down because of flaws in management thinking that skew their sense of the value of their company. Oded Ben-Joseph, managing director of Outcome Capital, applied behavioral economics to the M&A front to discuss how cognitive biases can derail M&A transactions in an article in the September issue of In Vivo. We spoke to Ben-Joseph about cognitive biases, why the life sciences sector is particularly prone to them, and what executives can do to minimize their effects. Oded, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Danny. Pleasure to be here.
We're going to talk about life sciences M&A deals and look at what behavioral economics can tell us about how cognitive bias, things like emotion, misconceptions, and wishful thinking, undermines the creation of value through these transactions by leaving them unconsummated. As someone who advises life science companies on M&A transactions, this is something you've seen intimately. I think that because this is a science-driven industry, people might assume companies have a fairly rigorous, data-driven process when it comes to decisions around these types of transactions, but human beings are human beings. How significant a problem do you think it is with regards to life science M&A deals?
So I think it's very significant, and as a matter of fact, I think it's central to any transaction that I've seen in my career. While I agree with you that, yes, in the life sciences industry, we have a lot of PhD, MD level people that presumably are more data-driven, scientifically inclined. The reality, however, is that people think emotional first and rational second, and this is a challenge that we face on a day-to-day basis with the companies that we advise. In addition, I think the life science industry is particularly prone to this issue for the simple fact that we cannot really use objective parameters that are used by other industries, such as EBITDA multiples, revenues, margin, growth parameters, and so on, that other industries, technology, oil and gas, whatever it is that you would like to think about, that this is a completely different segment with a very different dynamics in which people invest or acquire based on perceived future value as opposed to present value. And that makes life a lot more difficult, particularly for executives and board members.
Well, when we talk about cognitive biases, what are you talking about? What are the most common forms of that executives are prone to experiencing?
I think there are a number of those. Again, from our experience at Outcome Capital, I think the most pronounced bias is the inability to take the external view. In other words, maybe to take a statistical perspective that is based on evidence from the outside world, as opposed to a myopic, inward-looking perspective. I think that's by far is the most pronounced issue with life science executives. They tend to be very science-centric. They are very focused on their company, while being completely oblivious to a great deal of data in their industry. So our job, first and foremost, is to align technologies and companies with the dynamics of the segment that they're in. And more often than not, that segment is gonna be the determinant of the future, the reality and the future of that company, a lot more than the CEO or even the science. My point here is that taking the external view is crucial to any successful path to liquidity for a company. Of course, there are other biases that are fairly pronounced. Part of that external view and the ability to adopt a statistical mindset is the ability of management to sort of take the base rate into account. What is happening in your industry, in your particular sector or even subsector? What transactions took place, at what valuation, at what stage of the company? What is it that the buyer universe is looking for in terms of technology? And once you do what we call here at Outcome a marketing landscape analysis, very quickly you realize that every segment has its own dynamics. And while we do see what we call outlier transactions that fall way beyond the statistics, the overwhelming majority of those transactions are going to fall right within the normal distribution of transactions. And our job is not only to think about financial terms, but also think about the probability to closing, this is yet another bias that people often neglect, that most M&A transactions do not have a good starting point in terms of probability to closing. And our job, and again, by aligning the technology with its segment, with the dynamics of its segment, we're trying to increase the probability to closing, again, which is my humble opinion, is just as important as the actual financial terms.
There are human beings on both sides of a transaction. Are buyers prone to the same biases, or are there different ones at play for them?
So that's a great question. So the short answer is yes. I think we're all prone to cognitive biases, no doubt about that. However, when you have sort of multiple layers of management and multiple people on the sort of buy side, these companies tend to be much larger and they have processes in place. That serves, at least to an extent, to de-bias the system. When sort of highly entrepreneurial small companies usually have they don't have those processes in place, and they have a much more limited management team. So it's very helpful to use other people to sort of as a check for your own biases. It's very hard for us to see our own biases, but it's a lot easier for us to see other people's biases. So that's one of the many reasons why a large team tends to overperform a much smaller team, and that's one of the many reasons why larger companies are in a better position to transact, not just from a financial perspective. They just have a better de-biasing system.
Can you walk us through an example of a transaction and the types of ways that these cognitive biases colored the thinking of management?
Of course. Again, unfortunately, we see it with every single transaction to, of course, various degrees. But a good example is that we recently worked with a very interesting diagnosis reference lab company that actually had an interesting piece of technology, and it was an ongoing business with revenues and EBITDA, which actually makes life a lot easier from that perspective. And the board has determined that it's time to perhaps sell the company because they sort of reached a glass ceiling with respect to the sales, and there was no real team out there or no ability to develop a deep channel in their sector. So they sort of hired an advisor to assist them in an M&A process, a plain vanilla M&A process. The advisor, of course, took a much broader perspective, the external view, in addition to the internal view. but a much broader perspective, and sort of armed himself with quite a lot of market data, growth, EBITDA multiple, who are the players, what are they looking for, what is the competition out there, what's out there in the next couple of years on the technology side, who's going to come in with technologies that could render this company's technology obsolete, and so on and so forth. And the advisor came up with sort of a range that would be in alignment with market dynamics. And on top of that range, the advisor made an attempt to sort of identify individual synergies with individual buyers. So this is not a one fits all approach, but actually a much more tailor-made approach, a targeted point of view. Unfortunately, the CEO had a very different point of view. Overconfidence is another bias that is rampant in our industry, and of course, he massively overvalued his company and sort of created a whole slew of arguments against the sort of broader market analysis provided by the advisor. The difference was about 30-35% between the advisor and the and the company. Nevertheless, as we say, the market is always right. Let's go out there and see and let the market speak. And the advisor ended up with four bidders, four term sheets, three of which were from major multinational firms, multi-billion multinational firms that are active in this particular segment. Interestingly enough, those term sheets were very, very close to the advisor's perspective and were about plus minus 10% from one another. That within itself is a statistical fact. That within itself is the outside view. Of course, the CEO did not accept that outside view, despite this ample evidence, and chose to argue with every single buyer about valuation. And that, of course, did not go very well. Of course, it took a very long time. Eventually, I think that M&A process lost a lot of momentum, and eventually the board decided to terminate all M&A efforts. Now, I can tell you that those term sheets, those offers were not only realistic, but would have been very beneficial, very profitable, both for management and board. So it's not that they were way below market; they were very realistic, and it's a shame. Unfortunately, we see that fairly routinely.
You talk about various ways of debiasing thinking. I'd like to walk through each of those ways and have you explain them a bit, if you would. You suggest the need to create alternatives. What do you mean?
So we have a tendency to focus on one avenue, whatever it is. My point here is that there's always more than one solution to a problem. And we always try to be creative and provide multiple solutions to a particular quandary. So I think creating alternatives, at least as far as M&A, is the most important component. You can do it at multiple levels. You can talk to multiple buyers. You can reposition the company and add adjacencies technology-wise to sort of in an attempt to broaden the perspective, broaden the acquisition universe. You can not fall in love or marry one type of transaction. There are multiple transactions that could be beneficial to both buyer and seller, in addition to an outright M&A. There are multiple, build-to-buy structures and licensing transactions and so on and so forth. There's no need to just focus on just one particular type of transaction or one particular valuation. So that would be usually that's the first thing that we're trying to look at is that. The second thing is that we always adopt what we call a statistical mindset. It's an outwardly top-down, market-driven point of view. Yes, we are in a position to appreciate the science, the clinical aspect, the technology, but at the same time, it's very important as a debiasing method to understand the statistics, the base rate, what is the dynamics of your industry. Because as I said earlier, at the end of the day, it's the external view that is going to determine the reality of that company rather than the internal view.
You also talk about the value of a decision-making matrix or checklist. Can you explain that?
Yes, that's a good question. Well, we are strong believers as a debiasing method to use various algorithms and decision-making matrices. And there's been a lot of research in behavioral economics for the past 20 to 30 years that even a back-of-the-envelope simple matrix or algorithm is better than intuition, which is a bad word. It's an adjective, outcome capital. We try to avoid intuition and actually rely on data. So I think that management teams should think about how is it that they can create alternatives. What are the criteria of success? Focus on those criteria. Within the realm of a number of alternatives, each criteria, and then most importantly, have a discussion about that. And that I'm assuming that if it's a good management team, there's an open culture and an intellectual exchange type of culture. And it's very important, as I said earlier, to allow other people to keep a check on your biases, because I know for certain that we cannot do it ourselves.
You also advise on conducting a pre-mortem analysis, not a term I've heard before. Think of a post-mortem analysis. What's the value of doing a pre-mortem analysis?
I think it's helpful. It's a given that one of the most pronounced biases in our world is overconfidence, and what we call the illusion of control. CEOs are always overconfident about the technology. They're always overvalue what they have, again, while being completely oblivious to the statistical data. So I think that conducting a pre-mortem analysis is very helpful, particularly in that respect. It's a forward-looking exercise as opposed to a backward-looking exercise, which we always do, as we all know. And what it creates is a discipline around thinking not only about the upside of a particular transaction, but actually the downside. What happens if that transaction actually does not take place? This is very helpful. We do this routinely. It creates more. It forces the team to sort of leave overconfidence and ego behind and think about, again, more statistically, what can I do to alleviate or to offset or to reduce the probabilities of a transaction not taking place. So in that regard, I think it has been very helpful to us over the years.
You touched on this before, but getting advice from your team.
Again, it helps. It helps debiasing yourself. Decision makers have a real trouble, as I said, seeing when their minds are misleading them, but they can sort of more readily see that when other people are biased. So if you rely on your team, again, as I said earlier, supported by a culture of intellectual exchange, I think that will serve to keep one another in check and minimize. I don't think you can eliminate biases completely, but it certainly helps to minimize them.
And the last point you make is to take time to reflect.
So this is more of a cultural perspective. I think that most CEOs are type A personalities. They're very busy doing things. And my strong recommendation, is that sometimes it's better to be rather than to do. It's very important to take time to reflect. And when you do take that time to reflect, you're much more likely to detect situations in which more careful reasoning and rational thinking is required. So it's going to keep intuitive responses at bay. We have this system as communicated by the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, the fast and the slow system of thinking, and we immediately respond intuitively. And I always suggest to people, both internally and external at Outcome Capital, take time to reflect and think about the problem, and most importantly, allow yourself to change your mind.
In the end, is the best way to safeguard against these biases the creation of a formal decision-making process?
I think that's one way. I don't know if it's the best way. I think the best way is to first and foremost acknowledge the fact that we emote first and think later, or at least second. So acknowledgement of that fact goes a long way. Secondly, adopting a statistical mindset is, in my opinion, the second most important thing.
Is there a flip side here? Does cognitive bias also lead to buyers sometimes overpaying for acquisitions and pursuing deals that simply won't create their perceived value?
Of course. As we discussed earlier, there are biases, maybe to a slightly lesser degree on the buy side, but yes, we all know of what we call outlier transactions that are way out of the sort of normal distribution curve, that are, a statistical anomaly. There are many of those. I can give a lot of examples. I'd rather not in this forum. But yes, so the answer is yes.
Well, the article is How Cognitive Bias Undermines Value Creation in Life Sciences M&A. It can be found in the September 2017 issue of In Vivo. Oded Ben-Joseph, Managing Director of Outcome Capital. Oded, thanks as always.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.